The letter hit the table like a slap. Alma Conley stood in the middle of the Fletcher Ranch house kitchen, her traveling bag still clutched in both hands. Dust from the long road caked into the hem of her dress, and she read those words again, slowly, the way you read something when your mind refuses to accept what your eyes are clearly seeing. You will earn your place here, Miss Conley, same as any hired hand. There is no charity on the broken spur. You work, you eat. You stop working, you leave. I did not send for a wife. My brother did, and my brother is dead. Whatever arrangement he promised you died with him. If you choose to stay, you choose to work. Those are the only terms I offer. She looked up from the letter to find Reuben Fletcher standing in the doorway, framed by the brutal afternoon sun of the Texas Panhandle, June of 1882. He was tall, broader than she had imagined from the one photograph Ellis had sent her, his jaw set like carved sandstone, his dark eyes holding not a trace of apology. He watched her read his words as though he were observing whether something cold and distant and entirely beyond his concern. "You wrote this before I even arrived," Alma said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, and she was grateful for that. "I did. You decided before you ever saw my face. I decided the moment I got your second letter from Kansas City, the one where you said you were already boarding the train." He stepped inside, letting the screen door clap shut behind him. "I didn't invite you. Ellis did. Ellis is buried on the South Ridge. The invitation died with him." The betrayal of it struck her somewhere deep, not the betrayal of this man who owed her nothing, but the betrayal of fate, of hope, of the entire fragile architecture she had built around a future she had never even touched. She had sold her sewing machine to buy the train ticket. She had left behind the only woman in Hays City who had ever been kind to her, her neighbor, Marjorie Toll. And she had done it all because Ellis Fletcher had written letters so full of warmth and promise that they had felt like a fireplace in a cold room. Now Ellis was in the ground, and his older brother was staring at her like she was an unwanted piece of cargo dropped on his porch. Alma set down her bag very carefully. She folded the letter in quarters and set it on the table. She looked at Reuben Fletcher with eyes that had already cried every tear they were going to cry on the 3-day train ride from Hays City, and she said, "Then show me where you need the most help." He blinked. It was the first crack in that stone expression, just a fraction of a second, but she caught it. "I told you the terms." "I heard them," she said. "I'm accepting them. Show me where to start." And that was the moment, though neither of them could have known it standing there in the hot kitchen with the dust still settling and the grief still raw, that the Broken Spur Ranch began its slow, irreversible transformation. Not because of what Reuben had built, and not because of what he refused to give, but because Alma Conley had just decided that she was staying. And Alma Conley, when she decided something, was the most immovable force in the state of Texas. The story of how she came to be standing in that kitchen began 6 months earlier, in the particular kind of cold that settles into a Kansas boarding house in January, when the wind comes off the prairie like a debt collector, and you can hear it rattling every loose board in the walls. Alma had been 26 years old and bone-tired of surviving. She was not without skill. She could sew, cook, manage accounts, tend livestock, and doctor minor injuries with a competence that would have surprised the people of Hays City if they had ever bothered to look past the fact that she was alone in a way that made the respectable folk of the town uncomfortable. Her father had died in 1878, her mother 2 years before that, and the small farm they had worked together had been swallowed by debt within a year of her father's passing. She had come to Hays City with $30, a trunk of her mother's quilts, and a determination to make something that resembled a life. She had made something, but it was thin. Alterations for the dress shop on Main Street. The occasional nursing job when Doc Heller needed an extra pair of hands. Enough to eat, enough for the boarding room, not enough to feel safe. Not enough to stop that low hum of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence somewhere behind her sternum. It was Marjorie Toll who had shown her the advertisement in the Kansas City paper. Marjorie, who was 54 and had outlived 2 husbands and knew things about the world that she dispensed like medicine in small doses, at exactly the right moment. Rancher in the Texas Panhandle, seeking a capable woman of steady character for correspondence with intent toward matrimony, must be willing to learn ranch life. Honest reply preferred to polished one. Below it the address of one Ellis Fletcher, Broken Spur Ranch, Wheeler County, Texas. "I'm not a mail-order bride," Alma had said. "You're a woman who needs a different set of options," Marjorie had replied, and that was true enough that Alma had written the letter. What followed had been 6 months of the most genuine correspondence she had ever engaged in. Ellis Fletcher was funny genuinely, unexpectedly funny and kind in a way that felt earned rather than performed. He described the ranch with a poet's eye, the way the light came across the canyon at evening, the smell of the grass after rain. He described his brother Reuben as difficult but honest, which I reckon is better than easy and dishonest. And he had written it with such obvious affection that Alma had felt she understood something real about both men. Then in December, a letter had arrived that was not from Ellis. It was from a hand named Cutter Dawes, written in halting block letters, informing her that Ellis Fletcher had died of a rattlesnake bite on the 2nd of December, 1881, and that he had left a letter for her with his brother. Alma had read that letter 4 times, sitting on the edge of her boarding house bed with her hands going cold, and then she had done something she had not done since her mother died. She had cried until there was nothing left. She had never met Ellis Fletcher, had never touched his hand or heard his voice, but she had read every word he ever wrote to her and she had believed them, and the loss of that believing was its own kind of grief. She had written to Reuben Fletcher, asking whether Ellis's intentions had been formalized in any way that might give her standing to come. She had been careful, precise, not desperate. Reuben had written back a single paragraph stating that no formal arrangement existed, that he was sorry for her loss, and that the ranch had sufficient help. She had written again, asking if there was work available, paid work, any kind of work, because she was willing and capable and had no intention of pretending Ellis's letters had not changed the shape of her future. Reuben had not answered that letter. She had boarded the train anyway. She had told herself it was because the ranch was real, because Ellis had described it so clearly it felt like a place she already knew, because there was nothing in Hays City holding her back. But the secret she did not tell herself, the one she hid even from her own honest mind, was that she was afraid that if she did not do something bold and irreversible, she would spend the rest of her life in that boarding house room, just thin enough to fit inside the walls, and never really live at all. The Broken Spur was 340 acres in the Canadian River breaks of the Texas Panhandle, and it was beautiful in the way that difficult things are beautiful, with an austere, demanding quality that required you to look properly before it gave you anything. There were 8 horses, a small beef herd of roughly 60 cattle, 2 ranch hands Cutter Dawes, and a young man named Pep Morales who was 19 and still growing into his own limbs. A kitchen garden that had been half reclaimed by weeds, and a main house that Reuben kept clean but cold, the way a man keeps a house when he is living in it rather than inhabiting it. Reuben Fletcher was 31 years old, and he had been running the Broken Spur alone since his parents had died 7 years earlier. First his mother from typhoid in 1875, then his father from a fall the following spring. He had taken his grief and poured it directly into the land, which was a thing that land can absorb indefinitely, because land does not get tired of being worked. He had built the herd from 40 to 60 on his own judgment. He had repaired the barn roof, rehung 3 gates, dug a new well when the old one went brackish, and negotiated a water rights agreement with the neighboring Harper Ranch that had required 6 months and considerable patience. He was capable, hardworking, and controlled, and he had learned very early that the things you let yourself want were the things that could be taken from you. Ellis had been different. Ellis had been warm where Reuben was careful, open where Reuben was guarded, and Reuben had loved him with the particular fierce love of an older sibling who knows they cannot protect the younger one from everything and tries anyway. The rattlesnake had found Ellis on a Tuesday afternoon in a dry wash on the south section. By the time Cutter found him and got him back to the house, the venom had already done the work it was going to do, and Reuben had sat by his brother's bed for 14 hours watching Ellis lose a fight he had no business losing at 27 years old. What Reuben felt about that, he had put somewhere very deep and locked it down hard, because the alternative was coming apart, and the ranch needed him whole. The woman who had corresponded with Ellis was a complication he had not planned for and did not want. And then she had stood in his kitchen and said, "Show me where to start," and something in the architecture of his certainty had shifted, just slightly, in a way he could not immediately account for. He showed her the kitchen garden. It was, he told himself, the most contained possible task. Weeding, watering, the kind of work that required no particular skill, and would tell him quickly whether she would last a week or whether she was serious. Alma assessed the garden with the focused expression of someone taking inventory of a problem rather than being discouraged by it. She noted the surviving tomato plants, the overgrown squash, the herb bed that had somehow kept itself in reasonable order against all neglect. She asked where the tools were kept. She asked about the water supply. She asked whether Reuben had any preference for what was planted and whether the soil had been amended recently. He answered her questions curtly. She nodded and got to work. By the end of the first day, she had cleared half the garden of weeds and replanted 3 collapsed tomato stakes with a precision that Cutter Dawes, watching from the corral fence, noted with visible approval. Cutter was a lean, weathered man of 45 who had been with the Broken Spur for 4 years and possessed the particular loyalty of a man who had found his right place late in life. He had loved Ellis like a younger brother himself, and he watched Alma work with an expression that moved slowly from skepticism to respect. "She don't quit," he told Reuben that evening. "She hasn't been here a full day," Reuben said. "No," Cutter agreed, "but you can tell." Reuben said nothing. That night, alone in the kitchen after supper, Alma wrote to Marjorie Toll. She described the ranch in terms that were honest without being discouraging, because she was constitutionally unable to lie to Marjorie. She wrote, "The man is harder than the ground here, and the ground is very hard. But the place itself is everything Ellis described and more. I cannot explain why I am certain I belong here except to say that I am certain, and I have learned to trust that feeling when it comes." She sealed the letter and set it with the outgoing post, and went to bed in the small room at the back of the house that Reuben had assigned her without ceremony, and she slept deeply, which surprised her. The days fell into a rhythm. Alma rose before dawn, as she always had, and by the time Reuben came in for coffee she had already started the stove and set out the morning meal. He had not asked her to do this. He had told her the kitchen was her domain if she chose to use it, part of the arrangement, but he had not specified times or expectations. She chose to use it as though she had always used it, completely and without reservation. He noticed this. He noticed the way she moved in the kitchen without the tentative quality of a guest, the way she reorganized the dry goods shelf without asking permission, and organized it in a way that was, objectively, more logical than what had been there before. He noticed that the meals were better than what he had been producing for himself, which was not difficult because he had been producing the minimum necessary to maintain his own function, and had never particularly cared about food. He did not say any of this. He ate, he thanked her in a tone that was technically polite. He left for the day's work. In the second week, she asked if she could look at the ranch accounts. He set down his coffee cup. "The accounts. Ellis mentioned in one of his letters that the bookkeeping had gotten complicated since you took on the additional grazing lease. I have some experience with accounts. I kept the ledgers for the dress shop in Hays City for 2 years. The silence that followed was long enough to be considered meaningful. "I'll think about it," he said. He thought about it for 3 days, during which Alma did not raise the subject again, and then he left the ledger books on the kitchen table one morning before she was up. She found them with her first cup of coffee and said nothing about it at all. What she found in those ledgers was not a disaster, but it was heading toward one in the particular slow way of things that are not catastrophic, but are simply not optimized. The grazing lease on the adjacent section was costing more than it was returning in beef weight per acre. The feed expenditure for winter had been calculated correctly, but the buffer for poor hay yield had not been factored. There were 2 invoices from the Amarillo supply merchant that appeared to have been paid twice. She compiled her notes carefully, wrote them out in a clear hand on a separate sheet of paper, and left it beside the ledger with a short note that said, "Some observations if they're useful. Happy to explain any of them." Reuben read it that evening. He read it a second time. He came into the kitchen where she was mending one of Cutter's work shirts, and he said without preamble, "You found a double payment to Hargrove Supplies." $42, she said. "The second invoice is dated 2 weeks after the first for the same itemized order. It's possible the merchant sent it in error. It would be worth writing to him." "I'll ride to Mobedy next week," Reuben said. "The bank and the telegraph are both there. I can send a wire to Hargrove." "That would do it." He stood there for a moment in the way of a man who is deciding whether to say more than he planned to, and then he said, "This is good work." "Thank you," she said, and went back to the mending. Later, lying awake in the darkness of his bedroom, Reuben Fletcher examined what he was feeling and found it uncomfortable. Not because the feeling was unfamiliar, but because he recognized it as the early signature of admiration. And admiration for this particular woman was a development he had specifically decided to prevent. He had decided to prevent it because the entire situation had hidden trap written through it from the beginning. She had come here for Ellis. She had built a future around Ellis. Whatever she thought she was building now, it was built on the bones of that loss, and he would not be a replacement piece for his dead brother's life. He would not let himself want something that started that way. He told himself this firmly and went asleep. It took approximately 2 more weeks for the telling to start losing its conviction. The change came through increments so small that each one was dismissible, but their accumulation was not. It was the morning she appeared at the barn door at 5:30 in the morning because Pep had come to get her, his face pale in the gray dawn light, because one of the mares was foaling early and in trouble. Reuben was already inside the stall, and he heard Alma's voice before he saw her, steady and calm, telling Pep to bring the lantern closer. That was it. Hold it right there. She came into the stall without hesitation, assessed the situation in a single sweeping look, pushed up her sleeves, and got to work alongside him without a word of instruction, as though they had done this together before. She knew what she was doing. She did not ask questions at a moment when questions were a luxury. They worked together for an hour in the close, warm dark of the stall while the mare labored, and when the foal finally came, a leggy, dark chestnut colt that hit the straw and immediately tried to stand, Alma sat back on her heels and let out a long breath and looked at Reuben with something bright and unguarded in her eyes. "There he is," she said softly. And Reuben, who was not a man who said more than he meant, heard himself say, "Yes, there he is," in a tone that had nothing to do with the horse. She did not notice, or she chose not to, he was not sure which. The second moment came during the Mobedy run. He had not planned to take her with him. The trip was purely practical. The bank, the telegraph office, supplies. But Cutter had mentioned, with the mild casualness of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, that there were specific dry goods Alma needed that could only be sourced in town, and that it would save a second trip. They rode the wagon into Mobedy on a Thursday morning, and it was the first time Reuben had been properly alone with her outside the confines of the ranch. The road was 2 hours each way, mostly following the Canadian River Valley, and the country was open and sweeping in the particular way of the Panhandle, no single dramatic feature, just an immensity of grass and sky that had a way of making conversation feel both more and less consequential at the same time. She asked him about the ranch history. Not the business of it, which she already knew from the ledgers, but the human history, when his parents had homesteaded, what the country had been like before the cattle operations consolidated in the 70s, what he remembered about coming here as a child. He found himself telling her things he had not told anyone in years. Not because she pressured him, but because she asked questions that assumed he had interior experiences worth describing. And no one had assumed that about him in long enough that the assumption itself was disarming. He told her about his father breaking the first ground on the south section with a team of mules, about his mother planting the elm tree beside the house that was now 40 feet tall, about Ellis as a 7-year-old standing in the creek trying to catch trout with his bare hands and laughing every time they slipped away as though the fish were in on the joke with him. When he stopped talking about Ellis, he did not expect what came next, which was that she told him something back. She told him about her father teaching her to ride when she was 8 years old, on a horse so broad that her legs stuck straight out to the sides. She told him about her mother's hands, what they looked like, the particular way she pressed the heel of her palm into bread dough. She told him about the farm they had lost and what it had felt like to watch debt take something that had been built with love, and the way she said it, without self-pity, just the plain shape of grief acknowledged, made Reuben quiet for a long time. "I'm sorry about the farm," he said eventually. "I'm sorry about Ellis," she said. They let that sit between them, and it was not uncomfortable. It was, in fact, the most comfortable silence Reuben had experienced in years, which told him something he was not ready to do anything about yet. In Mobedy, while Reuben was at the telegraph office, Alma went to the general store alone. The town was small, a few hundred people at most, a dusty main street with the characteristic optimism of frontier commerce, false-fronted buildings asserting a permanence that the wind was always quietly testing. The store was run by a man named Heb who knew Reuben and was visibly curious about who she was. "Mrs. Fletcher," he ventured. "Miss Conley," she said pleasantly. "I work at the Broken Spur." She saw the man note this and file it away in the particular way of small-town people who maintain mental ledgers of social arrangements, and she knew that by nightfall there would be talk. She could not particularly care about the talk. She bought the items on her list, paid from the household account Reuben had given her access to for this purpose, and was careful and precise about it. When Reuben came out of the telegraph office, he told her that the wire to Hargrove had been sent and he expected a reply within the week. Then he hesitated at the edge of the boardwalk and said, "There's a lunch counter, if you're hungry." It was not an invitation as such. It was barely even a sentence. But she said yes, and they sat in the lunch counter of Heb's general store eating beans and cornbread, and it was, Alma thought, the closest thing to a pleasant afternoon she had experienced since before her father died. The Hargrove reply came the following Wednesday. The merchant confirmed the error, apologized in the restrained commercial language of a man who had been caught but was sorry about it, and enclosed a credit note for $42 against future purchases. Reuben put the credit note in the ledger, and when he came in for supper that evening he said, "Good catch, Alma." It was the first time he had used her name, not Miss Conley. Not the way you address someone at a formal distance, just Alma with the weight of recognition in it. She kept her eyes on the stove and said, "It was in the numbers. Numbers don't lie." "No," he said, sitting down. "They don't." The summer deepened into the particular intense heat of the Panhandle July, when the sky turns a flat, bleached white by midday, and the cattle stand together in the shade of the creekside cottonwoods and nothing moves if it can help it. Alma adapted to the heat the way she adapted to everything, by observing it, understanding it, and then working within its logic rather than against it. She shifted the heavy work to the early morning and late afternoon hours. She organized the kitchen to minimize the time the stove needed to burn during the hottest part of the day. She kept water crocks covered with wet cloth to slow evaporation. These were things her mother had done in the Kansas summers, things she had stored without knowing she was storing them, and they emerged now as naturally as breathing. Pep Morales watched her with the open admiration of a young man who had not yet learned to hide his reactions. He was 19 and gap-toothed, and worked harder than someone his age needed to, because he was still trying to prove something. His family was from the New Mexico Territory, and he had been on his own since 16, part of the large current of young Mexican-American men who worked the cattle ranches of Texas in an era when the work was plentiful, and the recognition considerably less so. Reuben paid Pep and Cutter fairly, which Alma noted and thought well of. She had seen enough of the West by now to know it was not a given. She and Pep had fallen into an easy working relationship built on mutual pragmatism. He helped her carry water from the well on the mornings when she needed to fill the garden cistern. She mended his shirts and occasionally left a plate of extra food on the bunkhouse step when she knew he had worked an extra long day. Neither of them made a ceremony of it. Cutter was more reserved with her, but the reserve was respectful rather than cold. He had his own grief about Ellis, carried privately and without display, and Alma understood that she was, for him, a complicated reminder of what Ellis had been hoping for. She did not push at that. She simply did her work and let time handle the rest. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the particular sudden way of ranch crises without warning, at the worst possible time, with compounding factors. It was the first week of August. The Harper Ranch, which shared a long western boundary with the Broken Spur, had a new manager. Thomas Harper himself had died in the spring, and his son-in-law, a man named Gerald Platt who had come from St. Louis with money and opinions and no particular experience with cattle country, had taken over management. Within 2 months, Platt had decided that the water rights agreement Reuben had spent 6 months negotiating with the elder Harper was no longer in the Harper Ranch's interest, and had sent a letter informing Reuben that he intended to divert the secondary creek channel that ran along the shared boundary for Harper's exclusive use. That creek channel watered the Broken Spur's eastern pasture in dry months. Losing it in August, with the summer heat still at its peak and the river levels dropping, would mean moving the cattle to the western sections where the grass was already thinning, or buying additional hay at summer prices, which were extortionate. Reuben read Platt's letter at the kitchen table with an expression that was perfectly still in the way that very serious weather is perfectly still before it moves. The agreement was verbal, he said. Alma had been at the table doing the accounts. She set down her pen. You said 6 months of negotiation. Was any of it in writing? There were letters. Then there may be a written record. Where are the letters? He kept them in a box in the office, a room that had been his father's study, and that Reuben used largely to store papers he didn't want to deal with immediately. They went through the box together at the kitchen table, and they found what they were looking for. 4 letters from Thomas Harper, written over the course of the negotiation, 2 of which referenced the specific terms of the water rights arrangement clearly enough that Alma believed a lawyer would find them useful. "Can you get to Mobity quickly?" she asked. "Half a day each way. There's a circuit judge comes through Wheeler County in September. Cutter mentioned it last week. If you file now, you might get a temporary injunction that prevents Platt from making the diversion until the judge hears the case." Reuben looked at her across the table. "How do you know about circuit court injunctions?" "My father's farm went through probate court," she said simply. "I learned more about legal procedure than I ever wanted to." There was a particular quality in his gaze then that she felt but did not name. He gathered the letters, made copies in his own hand, and left for Mobity at dawn the next morning. He returned that evening with a receipt from the county clerk's office confirming the filing of a complaint and a note from the county attorney that a temporary order preventing the diversion had been issued pending the September session. Gerald Platt received his copy of the order the following week and sent Reuben a blistering letter that Reuben left on the kitchen table for a day and then filed away without responding to. "You're not going to answer it?" Alma asked. "The court's already answered him," Reuben said. "I don't need to add anything to that." She smiled just slightly, and went back to what she was doing, and Reuben stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment longer than necessary, watching her. The September hearing came and went efficiently. The circuit judge, a pragmatic man named Birch who had seen every variety of frontier dispute in 20 years on the bench, reviewed the Harper letters, heard both sides, and ruled that the water rights agreement constituted a binding arrangement under Texas common law and that Platt was prohibited from the diversion. Platt was also ordered to pay a portion of the court costs, which Reuben considered a pleasantly appropriate conclusion. The victory should have felt complete. Instead, as Reuben drove home from Mobetty with the court's ruling folded in his breast pocket, he found himself thinking about the fact that none of it would have moved as quickly or as cleanly without Alma. Not the filing, not the organization of the letters, not the knowledge of the injunction procedure. She had pulled from her own hard history the exact tool that the situation required and offered it without calculation, without asking what it was worth to him. The dark past that she had described on that road to Mobetty, the lost farm, the years of barely, had given her something that was not luck and not accident. It had given her a specific, practical intelligence about how the world worked that most people her age did not have. She had paid for that knowledge in a currency he recognized because he had paid versions of it himself. He thought about this for the full 2 hours of the drive home. When he pulled into the yard, she was at the kitchen garden, checking the late summer squash in the long red light of the evening, and she looked up when she heard the wagon and the question was plain on her face. "We won," he said. The smile that crossed her face was the most openly joyful expression he had seen from her in 3 months on the ranch, and it was directed entirely at him, and it hit somewhere in the region of his chest like a physical thing. He looked away and unhitched the horses. August and into September, and the atmosphere at the Broken Spur had changed in ways that were real but unspoken, like a shift in the weather that everyone can feel but no one has named yet. Cutter felt it and kept his observations to himself with the discipline of a man who had been watching human nature long enough to know when to be quiet. Pep felt it and was less disciplined, though he confined his reactions to the occasional significant look at Cutter, which Cutter met with an expression of complete blankness. Reuben had begun to talk to Alma differently. Not about ranch business, which had always been direct and practical between them, but about other things. The news from the papers that came with the supply runs, the book she was reading in the evenings, the history of the canyon country, whether she had seen the meteor shower in August. She had seen the meteor shower. She had been sitting on the porch step at midnight watching it, and he had come out to check on a sound he thought he heard in the yard and found her there. And they had sat together on the porch step for 40 minutes watching streaks of light cross the enormous Texas sky without speaking more than a handful of words. And it had been the single most intimate experience of Reuben's recent years, which told him something he could no longer pretend not to hear. Alma, for her part, had been conducting an ongoing internal negotiation about Reuben Fletcher that was considerably more complicated than anything in the ledgers. She had come here for Ellis, and she had grieved Ellis honestly, not the romantic grief of a widow, because she had never been that, but the genuine grief of someone who had lost a version of the future that had felt possible and good. That grief had done its proper work over the summer, slowly and completely, and what remained now was something clear and uncluttered. What she felt about Reuben was not a translation of what she had felt about Ellis. It was not a substitution or a consolation prize. It was its own thing which had grown in the way that real things grow slowly from a specific soil in response to specific light. She admired him. She respected him. She had watched him over 3 months and seen a man of genuine moral seriousness, someone who paid his hands fairly, honored his commitments, worked alongside rather than above the people who worked for him. She had seen him gentle with the horses, patient with Pep's inexperience, quietly kind to Cutter in the particular unsentimental way of men who do not know how to be openly tender but find other ways to show it. She had also seen him alone in the way that only happens when someone has been alone long enough that the aloneness has become structural. She recognized it because she had lived it herself. It was the particular self-sufficiency that develops when you stop expecting anything from the world because expecting things has cost too much, and you convince yourself it is strength when it is, in fact, a kind of private poverty. She was not going to tell him this. That was not her place, and she understood that. But she also understood, in the clear-eyed way she understood most things, that something had been building between them all summer, and that the question was not whether she would do anything about it but whether he would, and that the answer to that question depended on whether he could get past the very specific thing that was stopping him. The specific thing was Ellis. She knew it. She had known it since the first week when she had seen the way he flinched sometimes at unexpected moments, when she said something that would have made Ellis laugh, or when the evening light hit the porch in a certain way, or when she walked past the south ridge where Ellis was buried. He was carrying the belief that whatever grew between them was a betrayal of his brother, and that belief was the hidden trap that everything else was caught in. She did not know how to address it directly because it was not, in truth, hers to address. It was a grief between a man and his dead brother, and there was no useful way for her to put her hands on it. And then the thing happened that she could not have planned and would not have chosen, and it changed everything. The first frost came early that year, the last week of September, and with the frost came the reminder that the kitchen garden needed to be put to bed for winter. Alma spent the morning of the last Saturday of the month doing that work, pulling the spent plants, saving what seeds could be saved, turning compost into the beds. In the late afternoon, following a habit she had developed over the summer of walking the ranch perimeter in the evenings when the light was right, she walked south. She had not meant to go to the ridge. Or perhaps she had meant to all along without knowing it. She arrived at the cluster of native stone that marked Ellis's grave as the sun was getting low, the light going amber and long across the grass, and she stood there for a while in simple quiet. Then she sat down on the grass a few feet from the marker and she talked to him. Not the way a widow talks to a grave, but the way she would have talked to Ellis if she had known him honestly, directly, without pretense. She told him she had meant what she wrote in her letters, that she had believed him when he described this place, that he had been right about all of it, the light at evening on the canyon, the smell of the grass, all of it exactly as he said, that she was sorry she had never got to meet him in person. She told him she was building something here, not what he had imagined when he placed that advertisement, but something real, and that she thought he would have recognized the difference between a thing that was real and a thing that was performed, because that had been clear in every letter he wrote. And then she said, "Your brother is a good man, Ellis. I don't know if that helps you, but I thought you should know I see that clearly." She sat quietly for a while after that. The sun moved further down. A mockingbird tested a phrase from the top of a nearby cedar post. She did not hear Reuben come. He had a rancher's habit of moving without weight. She became aware of him when he crouched down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence in the cooling evening air, and she did not startle. She just turned and looked at him. His face was doing something she had not seen it do before. The control was still there, but it had gone soft around the edges, and his eyes were dark and full of something she recognized as the particular kind of pain that only comes from love. "I come here most evenings," he said, very quietly. "I know," she said. "I've seen you." He looked at the stone marker for a long moment. "He would have made you happy," Reuben said, and his voice came out rough in a way he hadn't intended. "Maybe," Alma said honestly. "He seemed like he would have tried. He always tried. He was made for it. The trying." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I'm not made the same way." Alma looked at him in the long amber light. "I know," she said. "I'm not either, but I think we might be made the same way as each other." The silence that followed, that was long and complete and held in it the entire summer, every meal, every morning, the foaling at 5 in the morning, the road to Mobetty, the meteor shower, $42, and the entire eastern pastures water rights. Reuben turned to look at her, and his expression had changed in a way that was fundamental and irreversible. the way a door changes when it opens. "Alma," he said, just her name, and in his mouth it carried everything. She did not move toward him. She let him do that because it needed to be him. And he did. He reached across and took her hand where it rested on the grass and held it between both of his. And the contact was gentle and sure in the way of something that had been a long time coming and now did not need to prove itself. They sat that way for a long time in the fading light beside Ellis's grave, and it was neither sad nor strange. It was, Alma thought, exactly right. Ellis had brought her here. He had described a place worth coming to and a brother worth knowing, and she had taken the risk of believing him, and he had been telling the truth. The holding of hands became other things, slowly, in the way that trust becomes intimacy. Not all at once, not recklessly, but with the steady accumulation of days in which two people who are not by nature careless choose, again and again, to extend toward each other. October came to the Panhandle with the particular bracing clarity of fall in the high plain cold mornings, and warm afternoons and skies so blue and deep they seemed to press down on you like a benevolent weight. The cattle were moved to the winter pasture. The hay stores, supplemented by a purchase Alma had identified as necessary in August while prices were still lower, were stacked and covered in the barn. Reuben and Alma had begun to move differently in the house. Still appropriate, still measured, still careful, neither of them was the kind of person who discarded propriety lightly. But the quality of the space between them had changed. He came in for meals with a directness that was different from the perfunctory routine of the early summer. She sometimes looked up from her work just to find him watching her, and did not look away. One evening in mid-October, Pep came back from a supply run to the small trading post at Mobity Crossing with a copy of the Wheeler County Gazette, which he left on the kitchen table. One of the social column notices mentioned, in the dry way of frontier social columns, that Miss Alma Conley of the Broken Spur Ranch had been observed in town on multiple occasions, and that speculation was natural among the community as to her precise position at the ranch. Reuben read this and put the paper down. "The county has opinions," Alma said mildly. "The county can keep them," he said. But something in the notice had prompted him, and that evening after supper, when Cutter and Pep had returned to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, he remained at the kitchen table instead of going to the office as he usually did. He said, "I owe you something I haven't given you." She looked up from her book. "When you arrived," he said, "I was wrong to put it the way I did in that letter." He was choosing his words with the deliberateness of someone working with material he does not usually handle. "I was angry about Ellis and I put the anger in the wrong place. You didn't deserve that." Alma held her place in the book with one finger. "You told me your honest terms," she said. "I understood why. Understanding it doesn't mean it was right." He met her eyes. "You've done more for this ranch in 4 months than most people do in 4 years. You've reorganized the accounts, saved us $42 and an eastern pasture, helped bring a foal into the world and kept this house as though you were born in it. That is not earning a place. That is building one." She was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't trying to prove anything," she said. "I know, that's what makes it what it is." He reached across the table and touched her hand briefly, just a brush of fingers, just the acknowledgement of intention, and then said, "I'd like to ask you something if you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. "Would you stay here, not as a hired hand, not as an arrangement," he paused, "as my wife if that's something you'd want? I'm not easy to be married to, I know that about myself, but I would work at it every day, and I would mean it. There would be nothing hidden in it." Alma looked at him for a long time in the lamplight. Outside, the wind moved through the elm tree her mother-in-law had planted, and somewhere in the dark the horses moved in the corral, and the ranch was all around them breathing present real. "Yes," she said, "that's something I'd want." They were married in November of 1882 at the Wheeler County Courthouse in Mobity, with Cutter Dawes and Pep Morales as witnesses. Cutter wore his good hat. Pep polished his boots so thoroughly they reflected the courthouse light. The ceremony was brief and practical and exactly right, and when the county judge pronounced them married, Reuben took Alma's face in both hands and kissed her with a care that was the opposite of tentative, certain and quiet, and entirely genuine. Cutter congratulated them, and then had to look away and examine a distant wall for a moment, which everyone politely did not comment on. They had lunch at the lunch counter at Hebb's General Store, which was becoming a location of significance in their story, and Alma ate her beans and cornbread and thought about the boarding house room in Hays City, and the sewing machine she had sold, and the letter from a stranger in Texas that had made her believe in the possibility of something better. She thought about the January night she had decided to board the train, about Marjorie pressing her hand at the Hays City depot and saying, "You're doing the right brave thing." And she thought about Reuben's letter on the kitchen table and the way she had stood there with the dust of the road still on her, and decided she was staying. She was staying. She had always been staying. They drove back to the broken spur in the late afternoon, the flat Texas sky turning pink and orange above the canyon breaks, and when they pulled into the yard, Alma saw that Cutter had hung a lantern on each side of the porch steps, which was not a thing he had ever done before, and the small gesture of welcome made her throat close for a moment. She recovered it quickly, because Reuben was watching her and she wanted him to see her receiving the kindness without embarrassment, which he did, and he looked at Cutter with an expression that Cutter understood perfectly and returned with a brief nod, and then went to the bunkhouse. That winter was the quietest and the best winter of Alma Fletcher's life. She had always been good at winters, the containment of them, the way they made the interior life more necessary. But this one was different because the interior had expanded. There was someone to talk to in the evenings, someone whose mind worked in ways that were satisfyingly unlike her own. Reuben's silences were no longer blank to her. She could read what was in them, and she had learned which ones wanted company and which ones needed to be left. He was learning her too. He had figured out that she needed, sometimes, to walk, that the movement was how she processed things that were complex, and he did not mistake her afternoon walks for discontent. He had learned that she read voraciously, and would occasionally share a passage from whatever she was reading with the particular intensity of someone for whom the right sentence felt like a discovery. He learned to listen when she did this, because the passages she chose always told him something real about what she was thinking. He was not, as he had told her, easy in the way that Ellis had been easy. He was private and stubborn in the way of men who have had to rely entirely on their own judgment for a long time, and he carried his griefs deeply rather than on the surface. But he was honest, and honest in the specific way she valued most, not just the absence of lies, but the active presence of truth, even when it was difficult. In January, she wrote a long letter to Marjorie describing everything that had happened, and she used the word happy in it in a way she had never been able to use it before, not as an aspiration or a comparison, just as a plain description. Marjorie wrote back, "I knew it. I said so at the time. You told me I was too optimistic. I have never been wrong about people." Alma laughed reading it and read it to Reuben, and he smiled a full smile, the kind that transformed his face, and said, "You should invite her to visit. She's 60 miles away in Kansas. I know where Hays City is. Invite her anyway." Marjorie did come, in the following April, and she spent 10 days on the broken spur, and declared it everything she had imagined, and also confirmed the quality of the cornbread, which she had been told about in the letter. And she and Cutter had long conversations on the porch that Alma pretended not to notice and Reuben privately found very entertaining. "Your old neighbor and my oldest hand," he said on the third evening, watching the two of them on the porch steps. "They're just talking," Alma said. "I know," Reuben said, and his tone was amused. But Marjorie went home to Hays City at the end of her visit, and that particular story remained unwritten, which was fine. Not every seed planted in April bloomed. What bloomed instead, and with considerably more certainty, was the news that Alma discovered in May of 1883. she told Reuben on a Sunday evening, after supper, simply and directly in the way she did everything. His face went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, and then something much larger, and then he reached for her hands and held them and did not speak for a moment. "You're certain?" he said. "I am." He stood up and pulled her to him and held her with the particular care of someone holding something both sturdy and precious, and she could feel him breathing very deliberately against her hair, the way he breathed when he was containing something large. "Good," he said finally. "Just that. Good." But she felt what he meant. Their son was born in December of 1883, the first winter of their first full year together. They named him James Ellis Fletcher, James for Reuben's father, Ellis for the brother who had, in his own way, made everything happen. Cutter was named Godfather, which made him go out to the corral and find something very important to attend to for approximately 15 minutes before returning with his composure reassembled. Pep brought a carved wooden horse he had made himself, and it was better than it had any right to be, and Alma kept it on the windowsill. James was a solid baby with his father's dark eyes, and his mother's quality of absolute determination, demonstrated, from the first week, by the focused intensity with which he pursued every small investigation available to him. He grew fast and was fascinated by everything. Reuben was transformed by fatherhood in the quiet way of men who did not expect it to get them, which it did anyway. He held James with the same certainty he held everything: unhurried, sure-handed, and the child responded to him with complete trust, which seemed to satisfy something in Reuben at a level below articulation. Alma watched her husband with their son and felt, in those moments, the full weight and gift of the life she had built here. Not the life she had imagined on the platform in Hayes City, not the life Ellis had described, something better and more specific, built to the exact dimensions of the two people who were living it. The broken spur went on expanding. In 1884, with the water rights case fully resolved and the Harper Platte operation on the western boundary eventually sold to a Panhandle land company that proved to be a more reasonable neighbor, Reuben took on an additional section of land to the south, doubling the range available for grazing. The beef herd grew to 90 animals. Pep, who had grown into the kind of steady, capable hand that ranches are built on, took on a supervisory role for the new south section, and a second hired hand was brought on to help manage the expanded operation. Alma's role in the ranch's accounts had by now extended well beyond the original bookkeeping. She had a full and precise understanding of the operation's economics and had, over the previous 2 years, identified 3 additional areas of inefficiency that, corrected, had improved the net annual position considerably. She negotiated the supply contract with a new merchant in Canadian when the Hargrove relationship soured over an unrelated dispute about freight charges, and she secured better terms than Reuben had anticipated, which she told him was not brilliance but simply a matter of doing the arithmetic before the conversation. "You could run this ranch without me," he told her one evening, not with insecurity but with genuine admiration. "I could run the books," she said. "I can't shoe a horse." "Nobody needs everything," he said. "No," she agreed. "That's why there are 2 of us." He looked at her with that expression that she had come to know as the clearest possible window into what he was feeling, because he had given up trying to keep the window closed, at least with her. It was an expression of such thorough, unself-conscious love that it still occasionally caught her off guard, which she thought was exactly how it should be. In 1885, their second child arrived, a girl they named Clara Mee. Clara came into the world with an opinion about it, which she expressed immediately and consistently, and which promised an interesting future. James, who was approaching 2, inspected his sister with the gravity of a scientist, and then lost interest in favor of the barn cat, which Alma considered an entirely appropriate reaction. The family found its shape with the naturalness of things that are correctly assembled. The ranch house expanded slightly to accommodate the growing household, a room added to the south side, which Reuben and Cutter and Pep built over 3 weekends in the summer of 1885 with timber hauled from the canyon. It was solid work, done well, and it joined the house the way the years had joined the people without fanfare permanently. By 1886, the Broken Spur had a reputation in Wheeler County that was specific and consistent. It was a well-run operation, honest in its dealings, fair to its hands, and notable for the fact that its books were managed by the rancher's wife with a precision that several other operations in the county had quietly sought advice from. Alma had helped 2 other ranch families with their bookkeeping in difficult periods, not for payment, but because the help was needed and she had the skill, and this had built a goodwill in the community that went beyond what she had consciously sought. There were still people in the county who held old-fashioned views about the arrangement, about a woman running accounts, about the Conley woman from Kansas who had come down for a man who died and stayed for his brother, as some of them still described it with the selective memory of gossip. Alma had learned that gossip, like weather, is not worth fighting. You move through it and it passes. What it could not diminish was the reality, which was visible to anyone who came to the Broken Spur in 1886 and observed it for more than an hour. The ranch ran well. The people on it were cared for. The ledgers were balanced. The livestock were healthy. The kitchen garden produced enough to supplement the table through 8 months of the year. The house was full of the evidence of a life lived deliberately and well: books, children's drawings pinned to the wall, a quilt Alma had finally made time to sew from her mother's patterns, hanging between the sitting room windows. And at the center of all of it was the particular quality of 2 people who had found in each other the right kind of difficulty, not the kind that breaks things, but the kind that shapes them. They had their disagreements. Reuben was stubborn about certain decisions in the way of men who had made every decision alone for too long and had to learn, sometimes imperfectly, to make them in partnership. Alma had a directness that occasionally ran ahead of tact, and she had learned, slowly and with Reuben's honest feedback, to factor in the delivery as well as the content. They had shouted at each other exactly twice in 4 years, once about the South Section expansion, and once about a decision regarding James's education that both of them felt strongly about, and both times they had worked through it and come out on the other side knowing each other better. This, Alma thought, was what marriage actually was: not the absence of friction, but the commitment to move through it together and honestly. She had not known that in the abstract. She had learned it in the specific. Cutter Dawes, in the fall of 1886, told Reuben he was thinking about moving on. He had family in Colorado he hadn't seen in 6 years, and he was past 50 and feeling the pull of it. He told Reuben on a Wednesday morning by the corral with the directness of a man who has thought carefully about how to say a hard thing. Reuben was quiet for a long time. "You have anything keeping you here," he said eventually. "You and yours," Cutter said. "That's the thing about it. That's why it's hard to say." "Then we'll give you a proper farewell," Reuben said, "and you'll write when you're settled." Cutter left in October, and the farewell supper that Alma cooked was a thing that everyone at that table knew they would remember for the rest of their lives. Cutter gave James his good pocket knife, too old for the boy yet but kept for him until the time was right. He said goodbye to Alma with the restraint of an old cowhand who does not manage tears in company, but she hugged him anyway and he did not object. After he left, Reuben stood on the porch looking south for a while, and Alma stood beside him and did not say anything, because that was the right thing. Eventually he said, "He was here before I was running this place properly. He saw what it could be," Alma said. "I think that's why it mattered to him." Reuben nodded and put his arm around her, and she leaned against him in the cooling evening air, and the Broken Spur spread out before them in the October dusk. The barn, the corral, the elm tree, the lights of the bunkhouse where Pep and the new hand were settled for the night, the lanterns in the window of the room where James and Clara were sleeping. It had all grown from very little, from a letter and a train ticket and a woman who had stood in a kitchen, and refused to be sent away. In the spring of 1887, something unexpected arrived in the form of a letter from Kansas. It was from Marjorie Toll, but not in the way of her regular correspondence. It was careful in a way that Marjorie's letters never usually were, which meant immediately that something was wrong. Alma read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and felt the particular sinking weight of difficult news. Marjorie's health had declined over the winter. Her elder daughter, who lived in Topeka, had taken her in to be cared for, but Marjorie was finding Topeka uncongenial and her daughter's household crowded, and the combination of these things was making the recovery slower than it should have been. She had not asked for anything in the letter. She was describing a situation which was Marjorie's way. Alma wrote back and asked directly. Marjorie wrote back and said gently that she would not object to a different arrangement, but that she did not want to impose on a household with 2 young children. Alma took the letters to Reuben that evening. He read both of them without hurrying. "She has no one else," he said. "A daughter in Topeka who is managing her own family. A son in Missouri she's not close to. Can she travel? If someone went to help her with it." He handed the letters back to her. "Write and tell her we're coming in June." Alma looked at him. "It's a 3-day trip each way," she said. "I know where Hays City is," he said, with exactly the same tone he had used 3 years earlier, and she laughed, which was the right response, and she stood up and kissed him in the way of a woman who married the right man. They went to Kansas in June, taking James with them and leaving Clara in the capable hands of Pep's older sister Refugia, who had come to work at the Broken Spur the previous year and was formidably competent and quietly terrifying in the way of very capable women who know their own worth. Clara adored her. They brought Marjorie Toll back to the Broken Spur in the new room on the south side of the house, which had been intended as extra space and turned out to have been waiting for exactly this purpose. Marjorie settled in with the contentment of someone who has made a right decision, and she recovered her health over the summer with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had 2 reasons to recover. She wanted to see the children grow, and she was not about to give Alma the satisfaction of worrying about her indefinitely. She and Reuben developed a relationship that Alma had not predicted but should have. He treated her with the directness he applied to everything, made no sentimental concessions to her age, and she responded to this by treating him equally directly and occasionally telling him things about himself that were accurate in ways that he could not entirely dismiss. It had the comfortable quality of 2 people who have independently arrived at the same basic approach to the world. "Your husband is a reasonable man," Marjorie told Alma in July. "He is," Alma agreed. "I told you at the time. You told me he was difficult but honest." "Which is what I said," Marjorie said serenely. By the fall of 1887, the Broken Spur had become something that Reuben, in the depths of his hardest years of working alone, would not have had the audacity to imagine. It was not just a functioning ranch but a full household, children growing noisily, a respected elder on the south side of the house, Pep managing the south section with pride and skill, a second full-time hand and a part-time seasonal worker. And at the center of it, managing the accounts, raising the children, keeping the house, tending the garden, consulting on major decisions, writing to Marjorie's doctor in Canadian when a medical question arose, negotiating the supply contracts with a precision that made merchants treat her with the particular respect of people who have learned that underestimating her costs money, was Alma. Not the woman Reuben had told to earn her place. The woman who had become the place's foundation. He thought about that sometimes in the quiet of an early morning before the house woke up, sitting with his coffee at the kitchen table where she had first shown him the annotated ledger, looking out the window at the elm tree going from black silhouette to green detail as the light grew. He thought about the letter he had left for her and the particular hardness he had been armored in and how close he had come to enforcing it. He thought about what it would have cost him, what it would have cost the Broken Spur. What would not have been built, what would not have been repaired, what would have remained in the particular cold state of a house inhabited by someone who had stopped expecting anything. He had almost done that. He had almost enforced those terms and watched her leave and called it the correct decision. She came into the kitchen at 6:30 as she always did, James attached to her hand and already describing something with the voluminous enthusiasm of a 4-year-old boy. Clara carried on her hip, still half asleep, with her cheek pressed against Alma's shoulder. She settled them both with the practiced ease of someone who is very good at several things at once and lit the stove and reached for the coffee pot. And she turned and found him watching her and gave him the smile that she had given him across kitchens and tables and campfires and courthouse steps for 5 years now, and that was still, every time, exactly itself. "You're up early," she said. "Thinking," he said. "About." He looked at her for a moment. He thought about all the words that could go here: gratitude, wonder, the plain, honest arithmetic of everything that had happened, and he chose the one that carried all of it. "You," he said. She laughed softly, the way she sometimes did when he said something that was simple enough to be surprising, and she set the coffee pot to heat and kissed him on the top of his head in passing. And James clambered up onto the bench beside him and said something important about a grasshopper he had found yesterday. And Clara finally woke fully and demanded to be put down. And the kitchen came alive in the particular daily way that Reuben had come to understand was not ordinary at all. Christmas of 1887 was the fullest the house had ever been. Marjorie, recovered and cheerful and entirely herself, had taken on the task of teaching James to read with the focused determination of a woman with a project, and James was taking to it with the same focused determination he brought to everything, which meant that by December he was reading simple sentences with a pride that was magnificent and entirely justified. Clara, who was 2, observed her brother's reading lessons with the calculating expression of someone making notes for future deployment. Cutter Dawes sent a letter from Colorado with a Christmas greeting and the information that he had gotten married, which produced a response from Alma that was 9 parts delight and 1 part vindication, and from Reuben a letter that Cutter later described to his new wife as the most warmly expressed congratulation he had ever received, which, given Reuben's usual economy of words, meant a great deal. They made gifts that year. Reuben carved a set of small horses for James that were better than last year's and clearly improving toward genuinely fine, and Alma sewed Clara a doll with a pinafore from the scraps of an old dress, and embroidered its face with a particularity that Clara immediately tried to eat, which Alma considered an appropriate expression of love. On Christmas Eve, after the children were in bed and Marjorie had retired to the south room, Reuben and Alma sat together by the fire in the sitting room with the quilt from her mother across their laps, and it was quiet in the way that the ranch went quiet in the deep of winter, not empty, but settled, the way something is settled when it is in its right place. "I have something to tell you," Alma said. He looked at her with the particular attentiveness he brought to things that mattered. She took his hand and put it against her side, and she did not have to say anything else because he understood immediately, and his face moved through something vast and warm and certain. "Again," he said. "Again," she confirmed. He held her with both arms and she rested against his chest, and outside the winter darkness was quiet around the broken spur, and the elm tree stood in the yard, and the horses moved in the corral, and the whole ranch breathed around them, steady and alive in theirs. Their third child, another son, named Thomas Reuben Fletcher, called Tom from the first day, arrived in July of 1888, in the same room where Alma had slept her first night on the ranch, which had since been made over into the bedroom proper. He came into the world noisily and with evident opinions, which Marjorie pronounced a very good sign, and which Pep celebrated with 3 days of conspicuously excellent work that everyone understood was his form of expression. James, who was 5, regarded his new brother with the solemn assessment of a firstborn, and then declared him small, which was accurate, and then held him very carefully when given the chance with a gentleness that made Reuben look away for a moment and blink hard. Clara decided that Tom was hers, which she communicated non-verbally but with great clarity, and nobody argued with her. By the fall of 1888, the Broken Spur had 110 cattle, 4 permanent hands including Pep, a reputation for fair dealing that extended to 3 counties, and a household that generated more warmth per square foot than any building had a right to in the middle of the Texas Panhandle. Reuben had added a covered porch along the south side of the house that year, deep enough for chairs, and in the evenings when the weather allowed, the porch was occupied with the particular life of a place where people were genuinely glad to be where they were. The accounts were balanced. The water rights were secure. The grazing lease on the additional south section had been converted to a purchase, adding 160 acres to the Broken Spur's deeded land. Alma had negotiated the terms of that purchase with a county land agent who had initially assumed he was dealing with the preliminary conversation before Reuben arrived, and had adjusted his assumption quickly. The injustice of it, the way the world still expected a woman's competence to be a preliminary to a man's authority, was something Alma carried quietly and without bitterness, because bitterness was a luxury she could not afford, and also because the world was changing slowly, and she intended to be part of what it was changing into. She was not unaware of the larger world, was not insulated by the ranch from the reality that the country was still working out, violently and inadequately, the questions of who belonged where and who had rights and who was entitled to be seen. She knew that Pep's life outside the Broken Spur was more complicated than his life on it. She knew that the land under the ranch had its own history before the Fletchers, before any homesteader. She held that knowledge and let it inform how she treated people and what she expected of fairness. What she had here, in this specific place, was something she had built and earned and chosen, and she did not hold it lightly. In the January of 1889, she sat down and wrote the letter she had been composing in her head for some months. It was a letter to the Wheeler County School Board, proposing the establishment of a school at a central location between the 3 main settlement clusters of the county's eastern districts. She outlined the need, the available funding mechanism through a county education levy, the precedent set by similar schools in other Panhandle counties, and the specific children who would benefit naming them, which was the part she thought mattered most. Names made abstractions real. She sent it without telling Reuben until it was already gone, which was how she handled things she expected resistance on. He read the copy she had kept at the kitchen table and looked at her. "The school board," he said. 3 sessions a year minimum once a proper teacher is sourced. James could start in fall. And you thought telling me afterward was the right strategy. I thought telling you would turn into a negotiation about whether to send it at all, and I had already decided to send it, so I saved us the middle part. He was quiet for a moment that she read correctly as the particular silence of a man choosing not to argue with logic. "Did you use our address as the contact?" "I did." "Then they'll write to you here, and I'll read the letters when they come." "Naturally," she said. He shook his head, but without any actual displeasure in it, and she saw the edge of a smile before he picked up his coffee and went to the window. The school board wrote back in March. They were receptive. The process took 2 years. These things always did. But by the fall of 1891, the Wheeler County Eastern District School was in operation in a small building 12 miles from the Broken Spur, with a teacher named Miss Hofer from the Oklahoma Territory who was 24 and ferociously competent, and who would, in the fullness of time, marry Pep Morales and become another of the things that the Broken Spur had, in its quiet way, contributed to the world. But that was later. In the fall of 1889, on an evening in October when the light was exactly as it had been on that first evening at Ellis's grave, long and amber, and full of the specific quality of a day ending well, Reuben and Alma walked south together, as they sometimes did when the children were in Marjorie's capable hands and the day's work was done. They stood at the grave marker on the south ridge, and it was comfortable and quiet between them and the world. "I think about him differently now," Reuben said. "What do you mean?" "For a long time after he died, I thought about him the way you think about an ending, everything that was cut off." He paused. "He was a man who was precise with language because he chose every word. Now I think about him the way you think about a beginning, everything that came from him being who he was." Alma looked at the simple stone and thought about the letters in her box at home, not many, but each one true, each one the particular real voice of a person she had never met and who had nevertheless changed the shape of her life. "He would have loved all of this," she said. "The children, the ranch as it is now." "Yes," Reuben said, "he would have." He took her hand. She leaned against his shoulder. The sun went down over the Canadian River Canyon, and the sky turned its colors, and the broken spur spread around them in all directions. The land and the work and the people, and the life they had built together from hard terms and honest labor, and the particular stubborn miracle of two people who were made the same way as each other. She thought about the woman who had stood in this kitchen 6 years ago with her traveling bag still in her hands, reading a letter that told her she would have to earn her place. She thought about what that woman had been carrying, the grief, the soiled sewing machine, the thin years, the hope she had not yet learned to protect with enough caution to keep it small. She did not feel sorry for that woman. She felt instead something like gratitude for the exactness of the difficulty, for the way it had required her to be entirely herself right from the start. No performance, no softening, just the full force of her actual capacities in actual service of an actual life. She had earned nothing, she had built everything. And here it was around her in the October evening, her husband's hand in hers, her children asleep in the house behind the elm tree her mother-in-law had planted, the cattle settled in the winter pasture, Pep in the bunkhouse reading by lamplight, Marjorie's window lit warm and steady in the south addition, the whole breathing organism of the broken spur working as it should, in the way of things that are correctly and carefully and lovingly tended. Here it was, all of it, hers.